Hello, my dear students. Hope all of you are great and fine. Today we're going to keep on dealing with chapter 2. It's called The Mail. It's in our novel, A Tale of Two Cities by Charles Dickens. Setting, we are in 1775, still we are in England. Dover, Royal George Hotel. Here one more time the journey going from England to France, and that was in 1775. England, we're going to London, a carriage going to Dover. From Dover, a boat going to Calais. From Calais, a carriage going to France or inside France, Paris. Characters, we're going to get to know more about Lucy Manette, Mr. Laurie, Jerry Cruncher. Who's Jerry Cruncher? He is Mr. Laurie's assistant who delivered, gave him the message. Miss Pross, she's Lucy's nanny, who compensated Lucy for the loss of her mom. She was like her own mother. Main points that should be acknowledged by the end of this chapter. Let's have number 1, Mr. Laurie's arrangement to meet Lucy in Paris. Jerry Cruncher's hurry to deliver the note to Mr. Laurie before going to France. Here we have a change of plan. The meaning of Mr. Laurie's reply, which is like his response, recalled to life. What do I mean by recalled to life? Mr. Laurie's arrival at Royal George Hotel, which is in Dover. The description of Lucy Manette and Miss Pross. How Mr. Laurie paved the way to Lucy Manette concerning the truth about her father, Dr. Manette. Lucy's reaction once she knew the reality, that she knew that her father was still alive, and their decision to leave early in the morning going to France. Okay, before I start, let me refresh your memory one more time. There was two kind of plans. Plan number 1, it was for Mr. Laurie to meet Lucy Manette. It's going to be in France to take her inheritance. And inheritance, her money. Okay? So Lucy, she had no idea that her father was still alive. It was a kind of like a lie for her. She imagined that she's going to travel to France to take her money. That's all she knew about that. It was Mr. Laurie's duty or task that in France he would tell her, Lucy, your father was still alive, he had been found, and so on. For some kind of reason, whatever it is, Mr. Laurie was getting himself ready, here it is, to leave from England going to France. Okay? On his way to France, Lucy, she sent a kind of a letter to Tellison Bank declaring that she's an orphan. She has no kind of relatives. It's like a long distance, a journey going from England to France alone. Okay? So she said, I'm sorry, I would ask for that gentleman, okay, to wait for me in Dover instead of France. And I would travel under his own guidance. Okay? That kind of letter had reached Tellison Bank when Mr. Laurie already was on his way, going to Dover. So his assistant, Jerry Cruncher, okay, he rode a kind of a horse and he kept running to catch Mr. Laurie and asking Mr. Laurie, stop, we have a change in plan. Okay, we're gonna meet, Mr. Lucy Manette, not in France, but you're gonna wait and stop for her at Dover. Okay, here it is, Mr. Laurie's arrangement to meet Lucy in Paris. Mr. Laurie, he booked a seat, he reserved a seat in a carriage, and that carriage was going to Dover. And later, he should complete his journey to France. It was a Friday night, late in November, and we have a mist. That's a kind of a mist, if you can see it. A mist like a kind of a white cloud when you are unable to see in the early morning in winter time. Okay? The carriage, and that's what I mean by a carriage, is pulled by horses. That's a kind of, let's say a kind of a hill. There was a kind of a famous hill in England, it's called Shooter Hill. Okay? Here is the carriage. Okay, and inside, I want you just to visualize, inside the carriage, I have Mr. Laurie, 2 other passengers, and since we are in England, they were completely wrapping up, covering their own faces because of the fear of highwaymen, like I said before. And there was a kind of a guard, okay, a man who has a sort of like an arm or a gun, and the carriage driver himself. Here is the carriage. The carriage was somehow so heavy. Why heavy? It was heavy because of the mud, and because the horses were completely tired and exhausted, and because of the heavy load. So whenever the carriage, here it is, tried to go up, to mount up Shooter Hill, it couldn't. How many times it failed? 3 times, okay? So as a kind of a recommendation, it was recommended that the kind of the passengers would step outside the carriage, okay, and keep walking beside the carriage until the carriage would reach the top of Shooter Hill. Okay, once the carriage would reach the top of Shooter Hill, the passengers will just mount or just get inside the carriage one more time and complete their way going to Dover. When the carriage reached the top of Shooter Hill, it stopped, and it was time for the passengers to get inside the carriage one more time. There was a kind of a mist, so they couldn't see. But they heard a sort of sound of a galloping horse. A galloping horse, like someone is coming far away on a horse. So they looked for like in kind of fear, horror, and they imagined that that person who's going from far away, he is somehow a highwayman. Okay, so the guard or the coach driver asked that man, "Hey, you there, stop or I will shoot you." That man was Jerry Cruncher, the assistant of Mr. Laurie, and he was running because he was searching for the carriage, searching for Mr. Laurie to give him his own note. Okay, what kind of a note? It was the change of the plan. What kind of a change? That he had to stop and wait for Miss Lucy Manette in Dover and not in France. Let's read that part. With the coach not moving and the night seemed even quieter and the sound of a galloping horse was heard louder and louder. "Ho there!" the guard shouted as loud as he could. "Stand, I shall fire." The horses slowed. A man's voice, and that man's voice, I mean Jerry Cruncher, came through the mist. "Is that the Dover Mail? Why do you want to know?" "I want a passenger, if it is Mr. Jarvis Laurie." Okay, at that time, okay, Mr. Laurie, he said, "I know that man." He knew him from his tone of voice. He said, "Is it you, Jerry Cruncher?" He said, "Yes, Mr. Laurie. I came because I have a message, a note from Telephone Bank." So what did he do, Jerry Cruncher? He dismounted, or just he got off his horse and approached Mr. Laurie and gave him the message. Okay? Mr. Laurie opened the paper in the light of the coach lamp and read it to himself. The message said, "Wait at Dover for Mademoiselle." Who is she? I mean for Lucy Manette. It is not long, you see, the guard Jerry said the answer was recalled to life. What do I mean? Mr. Laurie, when he read, he said, "Okay, Jerry, go back to Telephone Bank and say that my reply to the message is recalled to life." Jerry was somehow startled, like shocked. "What? Recalled to life? What does it mean?" He said, "Just go to the bank and tell the bank that my reply is recalled to life." That part, you're going to read more in details inside our novel on pages 14 and 15. Let's stop here, okay, and let's know more. What do we mean by recalled to life? Recalled to life, Mr. Laurie, reply, it refers or it represents Dr. Alexander Manette. What do I mean? His reply signifies that with the help of Lucy Manette and Mr. Laurie, Dr. Manette going to be able to restore back his memory, okay? They would work together, like combine their own efforts, okay, to help Dr. Manette and recall him back to life one more time. So that kind of a message, recall to life, okay, it symbolizes, it stands for life, death, and rebirth, okay? Let's imagine that the carriage of Mr. Laurie, it reached Dover. So Mr. Laurie, he stepped outside the carriage and he went to like a hotel. It's called Royal George Hotel. When he went to Royal George Hotel, he booked like 2 rooms, one for himself and one for Lucy Manette. And he asked for a barber, like a man, to shave his own beard, and a breakfast as well. Due to the long discourse, like he kept talking with the receptionist at Royal George Hotel, it was clear for us as reader that Mr. Laurie had been living in England for the last 15 years, never to go back to France. How about Lucy? She's also living in England, but Mr. Laurie had never seen Lucy for the last 15 years. Okay, Mr. Laurie would be informed once Lucy's arrival. He asked that when Lucy Manette she's gonna arrive, please let me know, or at least notify me. I want to tell you about the description of Lucy Manette and Miss Pross. Lucy Manette, she's a young lady. She's not more than 17 years old maximum. She was wearing like a riding coat and a straw hat in her own head. Miss Pross, she was Lucy's nanny, governess, her caregiver, like someone who takes full care of her. She was dressed in extraordinary fashion. She was ready to leap into a battle, like to start a battle or fight for her ladybird. Okay, ladybird, I mean for Lucy Manette. She was highly devoted and she was completely loyal to Lucy Manette in her best and dark times, like in thin and thick. Okay, let's know how did Mr. Laurie tell Lucy Manette about her father and that he was still alive and so on. Okay, I'm going to just tell you quick and then you're going to read more. Mr. Laurie started by saying, first of all, let me just try to visualize what's going on. He knocked on the door. Lucy, she opened the door for him. She looked at him like she didn't know him. But he recognized Lucy Manette, the little girl, okay, whom he carried long time ago and moved her out from France to England. She asked him to come inside the room. In the room, he was seated and she just kept looking at him. She said, well, I received a message from Telephone Bank asking me to meet a gentleman and I should meet him in France. But actually, I couldn't travel to France alone because I had no relatives, I'm an orphan, and so on. And I asked for that gentleman to wait for me at Dover. Mr. Laurie smiled and he said, yes, it's me, like I have the pleasure because I received your message, okay? She said, well, in the letter, they told me that I should get ready because I'm gonna hear some kind of eager news or shocking news. So would you please tell me what kind of news it is? Mr. Laurie couldn't know where he should start, so he kept like moving in his chair, feeling uncomfortable. Then he said, well, Miss Lucy Manette, I'm a man of business. I am like a talking machine. I have no heart. Miss Lucy Manette, let me tell you a story. She said, a story? He said, yes, a story. She said, what kind of a story? He kept telling her a story about a famous French customer who used to be a doctor, and that was 20 years ago. And he used to invest his money in Telephone Bank. When he started talking, she said, stop for a while. I know you quite well. You were the man who carried me when I was still a baby, and you just moved me out from France to England. He said, yes, it's me. And she said, are you telling me the story of my father? He said, yes, but here comes a great difference. Your father, he was still alive. He had been found. Okay, Miss Lucy Manette, you had no inheritance, but we shall travel to France to see your father for the first time in your own life. Your father, for some kind of reason, had been just taken away from home, going to a dreadful place, okay, spending his time over there for almost 18 years. Now he's almost a wreck. Now he had a complete loss of memory. He needs your tenderness, he needs your kind, and so on. Let's read that part in more details. Lucy didn't recognize him at first, Mr. Laurie. He started telling her a story that turned out to be her father's story. He informed her that her father had suddenly disappeared and his wife feared that her husband might have been sent to prison. That's why she decided to raise Lucy up, believing that she was an orphan. Her mom, she died of a broken heart, leaving Lucy only 2 years old, still a small kind of a little girl. Mr. Laurie moved her out of France to England. He completed, Mr. Laurie, by saying that Dr. Manette was found alive but had completely changed because he suffered from a loss of memory and he was almost a wreck and he's someone who was completely damaged. Here is a part. He confessed to Lucy Manette that she had no inheritance and they would travel tomorrow to France Mr. Laurie had the task to identify Dr. Manette and bring him back to France. As for Lucy Manette, she had the task to enable him, Dr. Manette, to restore back his memory. How? Due to her love, compassion, tenderness, affection, and so on. I want just to read that part from your novel. It's like an extraction from the novel itself on pages 18, 19, and 20. That's Lucy Manette, she's talking. She said, "But this is my father's story, sir. And I began to think that when I was left an orphan through my mother dying when I was 2, it was you who brought me to England. I am almost sure it was you." Mr. Laurie took her hand, which she had stretched out to him. "Miss Manette, it was me." That part, you're going to read it more details on pages 19 and 20 inside your novel self. Mr. Laurie went on to tell her with much kind of hesitation or insistence upon business that her father had not died. He has suddenly and mysteriously disappeared. His wife, Lucy's mom, she feared that some enemy might have sent him to prison. Enemy, one of the aristocrats. By obtaining a lettre de cachet, from the king, okay, the French nobles had the right to do that at that time. But she tried as she might, she could learn nothing of his fate. She tried, Lucy's mom, she kept searching for him all the time, but she didn't find him at all, okay? That is Mr. Laurie's words. Let's read. "She died, he meant her mom, from a broken heart. I believe, having never given up her efforts to find your father. But she felt she left you to grow up without the dark cloud of living in uncertainty about your father." Here is Lucy's reaction. The first reaction of Lucy Manette, the expression of Miss Manette, that's her forehead. That's the part we call the forehead. On her forehead, deepened into one of pain and horror. She became somehow like she's completely horrified. Mr. Laurie completed and said, "But he has been found," and he meant by Dr. Manette. Mr. Laurie completed or continued, "He is alive, like your father is alive, greatly changed. If he's almost a wreck, okay? Your father has been taken to the house of an old servant, Monsieur Defarge, in France, in Paris. We, like you and me, are going to identify him. I to identify him if I can, and you to restore him to life, love, duty, rest, and comfort." Here is Lucy's second reaction. She said, she kept like whispering or talking to herself, muttering, "I'm going to see his ghost. It will be his ghost and not him." She couldn't believe it at all. Here is Lucy and Mr. Laurie when he was telling her more about her father. So that's the end of the chapter, to be more precise. But let me tell you before we end that part, okay, that it was decided that Lucy Manette and Miss Pross tomorrow and Mr. Laurie as well, they would travel from England, going to France to see her father for the first time in her life. Here's Lucy's reaction. She held his hands. Hands of who? Of Mr. Laurie, asking him to tell her more. Title like when you hold someone's hand, that part, "Tell me more." She couldn't tolerate what had just been said, as it was a great shock for her. She believed that she was going to see her father ghost and not him, okay? Her forehead, we said that's her forehead, showed feeling of horror and pain. She trembled, like shivered. When you tremble because you are cold, she trembled. And she was about to faint, okay? That's why Mr. Laurie screamed, asking for help. Who would come to help her ladybird? Miss Pross. Miss Pross, she came and she set a rough hand on him, pushing Mr. Laurie against the wall. Lucy's hands were cold and her face was completely pale. Okay? I hope just to get acquainted with the main points of and events of chapter 2, and thank you all.